a good-looking guy. You're a good-looking guy. Together. Good-looking guys.
Good evening to you all. Our last speaker of the evening is Dr. Kevin Randle, who will be talking about bringing the scientific method to the study of UFOs. Dr. Randle has spent 30 years in the field of UFO study. He's trained as an Army helicopter pilot, he's trained as an intelligence officer, and he's trained as a public affairs officer. So I believe it's safe to say this man knows the inner workings of the United States military community. He's interviewed hundreds of Roswell witnesses. He's studied the 1952 Washington, D.C. sightings, and he's studied the phenomena that we all know as alien abductions. So please, let me welcome to the stage Dr. Kevin Randle.
Thank you. In theory, you'll be able to hear me now. The technical problems were not my fault. I blame the computer world. Continuing. Brian Woods, when we did our presentations out in Las Vegas, complained about the quality of the slides, and he said we all should take some PowerPoint classes. So I went back to my computer, and I looked up how to do all this stuff, so this should be a jazzy presentation with movement and slides and everything. So what is science? Moving right along. Science has been defined as any systematic knowledge or practice. Doesn't tell you a lot. There's not a lot of passion involved in there. It's just a way of gathering knowledge. Science refers to the system of acquiring knowledge based on the scientific method, which we'll talk about in a minute, as well as an organized body of knowledge gained through such research. Once again, what we're talking about is a gathering of knowledge. We're not injecting it with religious fervor. We're not injecting it with any personal bias. We're looking to increase our knowledge as best we can. What's the scientific method? Simply, it's a technique for investigating a phenomenon, for investigating anything in the world around us. It's acquiring knowledge, or it's correcting and integrating previous knowledge into what we already know so that we can expand our universe around us. This must be based on the gathering of observable, empirical, and measurable evidence. Now, some people are moving into the idea of refusing to accept science. Exopolitics has just issued a statement which suggests that we reject science, but the problem is not science. The problem is the scientists, the people who will not listen to the testimony of the witnesses, the people who will not look at the evidence. It's the people who reject the scientific method. These are many times the scientists. And this rejection of science moves us back to the Dark Ages. If you remember, well, you probably don't remember because you weren't there. But if you've studied it at all, you understand that the Dark Ages was a period where knowledge was actually suppressed. The church governed everything. All knowledge ran through the church, and if it was counter to the church's teachings, no matter what those teachings might be, then that knowledge was rejected. Exopolitics is now suggesting we take their evidence on faith. They don't want us to look beyond what they're saying. We have to accept what they're saying as the truth without any kind of investigation. But science requires evidence, and I really have no problem with that requirement. I think that we should, in fact, look at the evidence. So the critical point is the emphasis is on seeking the truth. Science seeks the truth. Science does not confirm what we want it to be, what we want to believe. It's not denying evidence because we don't like it. It's about finding the truth, whatever that truth might be. So what are the main components that we're talking about here? We have reproducibility. But if you take a look at science itself, there's no actual requirement for reproducibility. A meteor fall, ball lightning, and other phenomenon are not really reproducible in the laboratory or by anything that we do. We have to be on site for the event to look at it. The evidence must be hard. And what's hard evidence? Well, it's physical evidence, pieces of a craft, landing traces that Ted Phillips talked about. There's instrumentality involved in hard evidence. That's cameras, that's radar, things that we don't control that can observe the world around us and help us out. And it's also testimony. Yes, testimony can be hard if it's gathered properly and is reproduced properly. And the observations must be scientific. So how do we move the anecdotal into the scientific? It's really the way we gather the testimony and how we report that testimony. See, we have motionless slides. I figured that this late at night, people are going to be sleepy. And if I had some motion in the slides, I could keep people awake. So what do I mean by rocks from the sky? Well, these rocks from the sky are not unlike a UFO sighting because they can't be predicted. The witnesses to these things are not trained, which means they don't have scientific training. The people that you would normally interview for a meteor fall are not your scientific people. They're not planned, they're random observations. Now, we know in today's world that some meteors can be predicted. We have meteor showers. But in 1803, when the French Academy of Sciences rejected the idea of rocks from the sky, they didn't know about meteors. So we have the anecdotal testimony that was gathered at that time, but it was accepted as scientific observation. The question we have to ask is, why was it accepted as scientific observation? As because it was properly gathered with no interpretations. No interpretations on that. It's only the observable facts. So as I said, in 1803, the French Academy of Science rejected the idea of rocks from the sky because everybody knows there's no rocks in the sky. There were reports of thunderbolts. I didn't think that was going to be funny. I should have planned this a little bit better there. Okay, well, so anyhow, we know there are no rocks in the skies, but there were things called thunderbolts, and these were things that apparently fell out of the sky and had been gathered. Jim Bowie, in fact, gathered an iron meteor sometime in this era to create the Bowie knife. So the Bowie knife was created out of meteoric remains. But these were called thunderbolts in the time, and there was some great controversy about whether or not they existed. This whole thing of meteors and rocks from the sky, when you look at it from a scientific point of view, is kind of what we're dealing with today with UFOs. So we have this fellow named Jean-Baptiste Biot. He's a French naturalist, and he was going to investigate a thunderbolt that fell in Normandy. Normandy, of course, a region of France. This was a meteor fall, in fact, that happened a few weeks earlier. So he wasn't on scene to witness the fall, but he'd heard about it, and he eventually went to the scene afterwards. And this, again, becomes important to us simply because this is how UFO investigations often happen. The researcher is not there, but goes to check an event that happened somewhat earlier. One thing he did do, though, he had found a geological survey that had been conducted a couple of years earlier, so that he knew what the geology of the region was. He knew what rocks he could expect to find. So he knew what to expect when he got there. So what he did, he talked to the witnesses, just as exactly what we would do in a UFO sighting. These witnesses were from every social strata, which means you might have some educated people involved, you might have some farmers involved, you might have some people who were not the best citizens of the area involved, but he talked to everybody from every social strata. He ignored the minor discrepancies in the stories. Maybe the timing wasn't right, maybe the direction wasn't right, maybe the description of the color wasn't quite right. But he looked at everything that they had to say. He gathered all that testimony so that he would have a good idea of what had fallen. And what's the important point? He recorded all this anecdotal testimony, the very thing that scientists today mock us. They say, well, there's too much anecdotal testimony. You don't have any real facts. In fact, in the press conference yesterday, one of the reporters talked about the anecdotal testimony. I almost said something to him then about that because it kind of annoyed me. What he did was he had multiple chains of evidence. And what this means, he had the scientific, or the anecdotal testimony that he had gathered. That was one chain of evidence. He had samples of the rocks that had fallen. That's another chain of evidence. He had the geological survey that became a separate chain of evidence. So he looked at all that evidence, and he built his case link by link, which means simply he said, this is what the witnesses said, this is what the analysis of the rocks that I recovered say, this is how the thing was described as it fell. And what this tells us, we cannot reject testimony simply because we don't like it. And too often in the UFO field, that's exactly what we do. We talk to a number of witnesses, and if there's somebody that says something that doesn't really flow with what we want to know and how we understand it, then we tend to reject that testimony, and that gets us in trouble when we go to publish our results. So what this means simply is we've got to look at all the evidence. And we often are talked about Occam's razor in the UFO field. And they say, well, Occam's razor says that there can't be UFOs. And what Occam's razor really says is the simplest solution that encompasses all the testimony, all the evidence, is probably the most likely. Not that the simplest solution is the most likely, but the one that encompasses all the testimony and all the evidence is probably the most likely. So as I say, he went out and he collected samples of the rocks that had fallen. He went to the site, often as we do in UFO investigations. He compared what he found there with older mineral surveys. And what this told him is that the rocks that allegedly fell from the sky are not similar to the rocks that were found in the region prior to this fall. So he had some evidence to say, this is very unusual, this is very anomalous, and we need to take a look at it. And then what he did was he compared all of this with other thunderbolts. Remember, we talked a little bit about that, there being other thunderbolts. Now, Ted Phillips said something yesterday in that same press conference that intrigued me, because I was thinking about this idea in relation to this, and we've got samples of the thunderbolts, and we've got the meteoric evidence that the scientists found on site, but how can we relate that to UFOs? Because we don't have that thing. And Ted Phillips was talking about how when he began his research into the landing traces, he realized there was a correlation between the landing traces and the type of craft seen, so that when he got on site, as the witness described what he'd seen, he knew what he was going to find in the landing traces, whether it had 3 landing gear or 4 landing gear, but there was a correlation between that. And so what he was doing was comparing the landing traces he was looking at with other landing traces he had investigated, and it became clear that there was a correlation among these sorts of things that was very important to what he was doing. So what we ended up here in France, in the French Academy of Scientists, based on a good scientific survey, one that they would listen to, not just reject out of hand and say, well, your testimony is anecdotal, your evidence doesn't exist, and that sort of thing, reversed themselves and said, well, yeah, there are rocks in the sky. The rocks can fall from the sky. So they embraced the idea of meteors. So let's talk a minute about the Great Falls movie. And we're going to talk about this because it is a type of physical evidence. We have something that was created through instrumentality, and it was something that could be measured, it could be examined, it could be tested, and it could provide evidence outside the testimony of the witnesses. In other words, we have our multiple chains of evidence here. So the Great Falls movie, for those of you who may not know, and I suspect there's probably not many in here who don't, was this film taken in 1950 over Great Falls, Montana by Nick Mariana, who was the manager of the local minor league baseball team. He said he was on the field to check the conditions that day. He and his assistant, or his secretary, Virginia Runge, saw these objects in the sky, these 2 bright lights in the sky, and he ran down to his car some distance away and grabbed his 16-millimeter movie camera and made a short film of these objects as they passed across the sky. So we have our multiple chains of evidence. We have something recorded, an instrumentality, if you will, and we also have the eyewitness testimony, 2 separate eyewitnesses. Unfortunately, they're together at the time, but we have 2 eyewitnesses for that. So as I say, we have our multiple chains of evidence. We have our eyewitness testimony. We have the movie footage that can be analyzed. But what's important here, we also have other corroboration that eventually came forward. So after the story ran in newspapers, there were other people who came forward and said, well, we saw the same thing at the same time. This would have been important had they come forward before that, and you could suggest that they were contaminated and may not have been the best witnesses. They may have come forward simply because they had read about the publicity. But we do have those additional witnesses. They've been ignored since 1950 because they didn't come forward at the beginning. What was the Air Force response? Well, they weren't interested in this. They said they didn't investigate UFOs anymore. If you remember your chronology, we had Project Sign, started in 1948. They did a big report at the end of that and concluded there was nothing to this. And according to the press releases that came out at the time, they stopped investigating UFOs. We, of course, know that's not true, that they just changed the code name and continued to march. So they eventually analyzed the film, and no surprise, they decided that there were 2 fighter planes in the area at the time, and that explained the footage, and they were all done. In the middle of the 1950s, Dr. R.M.L. Baker, I've left the R off my slide for crying out loud. He ran a series of tests, and these were very complex tests, from static tests, looking at the reflectivity of various objects, using a 16-millimeter movie camera to film these sorts of things. We filmed aircraft flying over the area so he could see how it compared to the Montana movie. And interestingly, the only thing that duplicated part of the film was a C-47, seen at 12 miles. C-47 is a twin-engine aircraft, and there's no record of any of them flying formation in Great Falls on that day. Baker's conclusions were that the F-94s, the jet aircraft that the Air Force talked about, was not a good solution simply because at the range the fighters would have had to be, they would have been identifiable. Now, as you look at an object in the sky, sometimes as it moves across, it's blurred out, it's reflecting the sun, and everything is washed out in that reflection. But as it moves across the sky, that reflection diminishes, and you begin to pick up the wings or the tail, and they become identifiable. And Baker's conclusion was that aircraft, for the length of the film, would have eventually been identifiable. The speed suggested they weren't birds, and he suggested it did not show balloons, and he was certain that any aircraft seen over the area would have been identifiable. So what do we do? What do we do about this? We look at it a little bit further. Mariana claimed the Air Force altered his film. So here's where we can do a little bit of science, because we have the film. This is independent. We have the images on the film. This is all physical evidence. This can be measured. It has a specific length. It has a specific width, and it moved through the camera at a specific speed. And Barry Greenwood knew all of this. So Mariana claimed that the Air Force had altered his film. The Air Force came back and said, well, no, there was a damaged sprocket on it, and we just removed that sprocket. And if you take a look at the Project Blue Book files, you'll find the notice in there, or the letter to Mariana that said we removed a single frame, which is a great cover for if you move 40 or 50 frames, because they're admitting to the one, so there's a splice in the film. Greenberg's evidence for this, we have John Werner, who said it wasn't complete. After he'd seen the film before Mariana submitted it to the Air Force, and he said it wasn't complete when he got it back. This E.P. Furlong said it was considerably shorter, and this Tony Dilek said a lot was missing. So what's important here is we're not really going to rely on the memories of these people who tell us that the film has been altered and that they're in direct conflict with the Air Force. We're going to wonder about who do we believe, the Air Force or these people? And again, this is where we can do a little bit of science, although it's rather basic. What's the length of the film? Well, according to information that Barry Greenwood was able to recover, and based on newspaper clippings and other documentation from the time, he said that the leader in all was about 14 feet. An Air Force officer in a report sent in 1950 said it's about 15 feet. And the returned film was at least 2 feet shorter. And these are Barry Greenwood's calculations. I want to give him plenty of credit there. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the specific links of the film and the specific quotes that Barry Greenwood was able to find. But if you want all those details, the highlights are in the proceedings. So I laid all of that out in the paper, and the proceedings are great links, so you can read all of that. So let's go back to the length of the film with Baker. He did an article, reported there were 225 frames in the film. He did not count 65 frames at the beginning, but that would have totaled 290 frames. Greenwood's copy that he got from the Air Force or from the archives, and similar to the one that I was able to get from him as well, said it was 243 frames. So there's at least 47 frames missing from that. Condon, the people that we like to poke fun at all the time, actually did some science periodically. And they re-interviewed Mariana and Runge, and they confirmed the sighting. There's no reason to question the validity of these two people. They took them through the whole thing. They had Mariana recreate running to the car to pick up his camera and all of that, so he got an idea of how long the objects were in sight. And they did those sorts of tests. But they confirmed that the film was 80 frames short. So Mariana had claimed that there were 35 frames missing. Condon tells us there's 80 frames missing. But what is important here is we have independent corroboration for all of that, for the length of the film and the missing frames. The Condon Committee analysis said, and I love this, while the hypothesis F-84 is tenable, it conflicts with some of the soft data. Now remember earlier we talked about what is hard data, and testimony could be hard data if it was gathered properly. This is the equivalent to the modern scientists, the modern skeptics, the modern debunkers telling us that the evidence is anecdotal. So what they're saying there is this is the F-94 hypothesis conflicts with the anecdotal testimony of the two witnesses. And they suggested that the objects are unidentified, which is very interesting. Condon Committee says the objects are unidentified, but it's possible it was the F-94s. Greenwood used his science, and I like to point that out, because he collected objective data on the length of the film. He proved, I think to everybody's satisfaction, that the film had been altered. Not the single frame that the Air Force talked about, but much more of the movie had been removed. And he proved that the Air Force manipulated the data, and I'm sure that that's a great surprise to everybody here. And he offered no explanation for the film. So we had an opportunity there to do a little bit of science. Granted, it's very tedious type work. It's measuring the length of films. It's gathering data on the number of frames, and it's gathering this sort of thing. But it is science, because here is something that we cannot argue about, because we have the evidence to take us in that direction. And anybody who wanted to follow us could find the same thing. All they had to do was take a look. Let's talk about Levelland, Texas for 1957, and this is a case that's always fascinated me. What we know is the object was seen by witnesses in at least 13 locations, as near as I can tell, and there may be others in other locations that have not come forward or have not been interviewed. It was seen close to the ground. It interacted with the environment, and some 50 years later, we learned there was a burned area reported. In other words, there was a landing trace that had to do with that. So again, we're left with multiple chains of evidence. We have something that interacts with the environment. We have witnesses in lots of different locations. And we have the burned area. So this allows us to do some real science. Let's talk about the Air Force investigation. It lasted nearly a day. The sergeant who went to Levelland, and I suspect he might have been from the Air Force base there in Lubbock, because Lubbock is close to Levelland, interviewed 3 witnesses. He determined that weather was a factor, but I don't know what brought that on. And this case, interestingly, was solved as ball lightning. Now, if you go back and you take a look at the scientific community in 1957, you'll understand that ball lightning was considered a phenomena that did not exist. There was no evidence there was ball lightning. And so here's the Air Force trying to prove that there was nothing unusual at Levelland by suggesting a phenomenon that did not exist was responsible for it. We have NICAP, which is the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, and in the guise of Major Don Kehoe, fighting it out with the Air Force about this. Kehoe claimed there were 9 witnesses. The Air Force said, Kehoe's lying, there's only 3 witnesses. Because in the Air Force mind, the Air Force eye, if they didn't talk to the witness, that witness did not exist. The problem with this, both were wrong. There were at least 13 witnesses, or witnesses at 13 different locations. And that makes Kehoe righter than the Air Force, if you will. But here's the point. The Air Force attempted to minimize the case. The Air Force ignored witnesses that they did not talk to. The Air Force explanation was scientifically in error, especially in the time frame. But the Air Force attitude, and often the debunker attitude, is any explanation is better than none. And eventually people will begin to believe it. If we remember back in 1997, and I think everybody in the room is over 12 years old, so you probably do, the Air Force explained the Roswell case as a Project Mogul balloon and the recovery of the bodies as anthropomorphic dummies. The media at the time, if you watched the press conference, didn't believe it. The Air Force colonel who was standing in front of the news media giving the explanation didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. I don't think Stan Friedman believed it. Don Schmitt didn't believe it. And even the little kid down the street probably didn't believe it. But they offered an explanation. What astonishes me today is an awful lot of people now accept that explanation as authentic. I just can't believe it. So what we've learned from that, from the Levelland case, is simply that the Air Force investigation was geared to explaining the sighting. They didn't talk to the witnesses. And some 50 years later, Don Burleson from Roswell went to Levelland, talked to the daughter of the sheriff, who also saw the object much closer than people thought he had, and was told that there was a burned area north of Levelland that he'd gone out and inspected. But that never made it into any of the reports or any of the documentation of the time, simply because if there's a burned area, you can't explain it as ball lightning. So all we've really done there is we've shown through the documentation, through the evidence that's available, that the Air Force didn't do a very good job. They were simply interested in explaining UFO sightings. And later on, they didn't care what they said. And I don't know if Stan mentioned this or not, but when the Air Force completed their investigation in 1969, they had some 12,000 sightings that they had cataloged, and of those, 703 were unidentified. But what I found interesting is about 4,000 of them were labeled as insufficient data for scientific analysis, which means simply there's no explanation, but they are labeled. And I wonder if you've got the witnesses, you've got the time of day, you've got the direction, if you've got a few other minor facts, you've got enough information to begin your analysis. The Air Force simply didn't bother. They said, insufficient data, that's the end of that. So we're going to take a look at a skeptical experiment. The mission of this experiment was to help people think rationally and question the credibility of so-called UFO professionals. It was to bring the charlatans, which would be all of us, but I think specifically Stan, because I noticed in one argument he was called specifically a charlatan. But bring all the charlatans out of the woodwork to drum up the controversy, to expose it was nothing more than a prank, and to show everyone how unreliable eyewitness testimony and accounts are, along with the investigators of UFOs, which would be many of us here in the room. So what's interesting is, this is in fact science. What this means is they designed an experiment, they identified the variables they wanted to test, they conducted their experiment, and they drew conclusions from it. So we've got a test that was conducted over a period of several weeks, and we know what went on because they reported exactly what they'd seen on a number of websites and on YouTube. The experimenters, and I have it in quotes, and you'll find out why soon, said that they would call the local media to get their reaction. They would call MUFON, specifically mentioned MUFON, and they would call the newspapers. At this point, I think we can say they validated their experiment because they were manipulating the data to get the results they wanted. They believed that the media and MUFON would go for the extraterrestrial immediately, and rather than launch their balloons, they called the media and MUFON to get them out there to investigate. Well, the balloons were spotted by a fellow named Paul Hurley. He said there were 5 red lights. He said they were a strange pattern, which is an interpretation, because I don't know why he would think the pattern was strange. And he said 1 light dropped out, which of course it did. He said they were not aircraft because he was a pilot, and he had more than 500 hours. Hurley may be the most vocal of the witnesses of this thing, and he was maybe the first. And his descriptions of what he had seen, were accurate. The interpretation, strange pattern, is not an accurate statement. There was a 911 call that these fellows put into their evidence as they presented it. And it was a guy who said he walked out of the house. He saw these strange lights in the sky. He said it looked like they were parachutes or flares, or maybe they were balloons. Well, this guy was exactly right. That's exactly what it was. He even identified the object correctly by saying they were balloons, which is in conflict with the conclusions that the experimenters drew at the end of their conclusions, that nobody would get this right. This, of course, shows you the strange pattern of the 5 red lights. The local police were called by the media. They told them it was balloons, and their best guess, it was road flares. The police were exactly right. It was road flares on balloons. Again, this is in conflict with what the experimenters said. There were 2 witnesses who came forward. They said they were 20-somethings. They said the craft, the objects, whatever they were, literally flew over our car. They were asked about flares. Could they have been flares? They said, no way. They zipped over our car. And one of them actually wanted to know what it was. He says, I can't tell you what it was because I don't know. I wish somebody would tell us what it was. They provided the dramatic testimony that moved the sightings from the idea of balloons in the sky to something else because we're talking about things buzzing their car. These 2 20-somethings were Joe Rudy and Chris Russo, and they were identified in the news reports by the local media in exactly that way. So we know who these guys are that said the object came down and buzzed their car. The news media, and this is where we get into trouble now with scientific observation, anecdotal testimony, and all of that nonsense. The news media came in, and rather than find out what happened, one reporter said, is it aliens? Why would you assume that? One reporter asked, was it a UFO? Meaning, of course, was it a flying saucer, a craft from another world? And another reporter belittled the idea of UFOs. No witness suggested anything about spaceships until it was brought up by the news media. No one talked about aliens or anything like that until the media induced them to say so. And we don't know what all went on in those interviews, but anybody who's been interviewed by television for any reason knows that the reporter will ask you questions and leading questions until he or she gets exactly the information he or she wants and then runs with it. The Ford dealer in the area exploited the interest in it by running a full-page ad about flying saucers and aliens and come out to Ford and you'll get an out-of-the-world deal and that sort of nonsense. Because, of course, advertisers are very clever and can draw on these very, very real puns. So the experimenters took their camera to Ford. We have unidentified witnesses now asked for their opinions, to offer their opinions. They talk of objects moving against the wind, these unidentified witnesses in the Ford dealership. The problem is only part of the interviews were released. But here we have a chance to do some real science because they're talking about the objects moving against the wind. So we can gather winds aloft data. And anybody who's looked at winds aloft data or anybody who's a pilot knows what the surface winds are isn't necessarily what the winds are at 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, or 20,000 feet. They can actually be blowing in opposite directions. So while the wind is blowing in your face and the object is coming from behind you and over your head going in the opposite direction, the winds aloft may be the reason for that. You've got to understand that the winds at the surface don't relate to what they are aloft. But what we did notice about this, all of this now, we have the witness descriptions that are accurate. They talked of the red lights. They talked of winking. And they explained why they thought they winked. I've got a better explanation now that I'll offer in a moment. But the witness interpretations were often inaccurate. Again, Paul Hurley and his strange formations. Others talking about, well, it could be aliens, but only after they were asked about it. But we've got the interpretations being offered by the media, changing where things are going. And the video interviews that we're allowed to listen to, and we only get parts of them, suggest there was leading. So we don't know whether some of these interviews were conducted by the media or the experimenters. We just don't know where that information came from, which is important for what we want to do. So the solutions that we come up with, based on all the testimony we have right now, is it cannot be flares. And why do we say that? Objects buzzed the car, they moved against the wind. If it was balloons, couldn't do it. And the full dealership witnesses were the ones that said the objects moved against the wind. The solutions that were offered. Well, the police claims it was flares. MUFON investigation said it was a man-made hoax. And this is where we get to good Mark D'Antonio said it was flares or Chinese lanterns. And in talking to him just today, I was talking about the winking, and he said it's because it's a flame source for it. It wasn't because the objects were moving behind the trees, as one of the witnesses thought, but it's because it was a flame source. So he said it was either flares or Chinese lanterns when he was asked to investigate it. So the MUFON investigation was dead bang on. When we get to a bit of a problem, we got Bill Burns, who was interviewed, or his testimony is cut into some of this. I think Bill Burns and the UFO hunters went into the area right away to take a look around. Bill Burns said it wasn't flares, but the problem I have with that is the video testimony that they present with Bill Burns and the people talking about not being flares is actually from other sightings. You've got a police officer standing there talking about the lights, and there's mountains behind him. I'm thinking the police officer's actually in Phoenix talking about the Phoenix lights, not talking about this specific sightings in New Jersey, because there's not a whole lot of mountain in New Jersey. And Bill Burns may have heard the reports of the UFO buzzing the cars, because that was part of what the media was talking about. And so, given that information, his conclusion makes some sense that it wasn't flares. We now know it was flares, but I don't think we can really criticize Bill Burns for his explanation a few weeks into this thing. So what did we learn about all of this? We learned that the witness testimony was accurate. The witness interpretations was inaccurate. We learned that the media, and this was a stunning surprise, would lead the witnesses. And we know the ultimate solution was impossible based on some of that witness testimony. This case should have remained and would have remained unidentified. But then we have a major revelation. The only witnesses who were in error turned out to be the car dealer's employees who talked about the winds aloft data, and the witnesses, Chris Russo and Joe Rudy, who talked about the light buzzing their cars and not knowing what it was. The two 20-somethings who conducted the experiment, Chris Russo and Joe Rudy, they launched the balloons. They told lies. I heard that. It's not nearly as neat as my ringtone. So they told lies to prove that we in the UFO field are charlatans. They told lies because they wanted to get to the evidence that witnesses did not accurately report what they saw. But all they really suggested, all they really proved, was they didn't understand science whatsoever. And the problem here is the skeptics loved it because it proved only what they believed to be the truth. So we have a skeptical experiment that failed. It failed because the experimenters injected themselves into the experiment. And anybody who's conducted an experiment knows, especially if you're trying to get something like this, you stay as far away from it as possible. You create a double-blind situation, so those who are helping you conduct the experiment don't know what results you expect. These guys told lies to keep it going. They said it buzzed their car. They said they didn't know what it was, and yet they were out there launching the balloons. So they misled the investigators, and they misled the media. And what did we find out? The MUFON investigation was right on. The police was right on. They said it was balloons. Some of the people who were interviewed said it was balloons. And what I find interesting is these two guys were so dumb that in proving how bad UFO witnesses are, they included all this testimony. So you could see how the witnesses were right about what they said. But they showed the news media questioning. They had a little girl with a sucker. And I call it a sucker as opposed to a lollipop because I think that's what the media was. And the reporter asked it about, could it be aliens? Well, first of all, is a 6-year-old going to know what that means? And second of all, do we really need the opinion of a child who didn't see anything? But you get a nice soundbite out of that. So what have we learned? We learned science is about truth. It's not about what I want to believe. It's not about what you want to believe. It's about the truth. Where does the truth take us? And we can take a look at any number of investigations where we've believed witnesses when we shouldn't have. We've ignored witnesses that we shouldn't have because we were going for a specific explanation. We were going for a result that we wanted. But science, when it is conducted dispassionately, is about getting the truth. And here, interestingly, I took astronomy at the University of Iowa. And I say this only because now I can say that I studied astronomy under James A. Van Allen, whom you've all heard of. He's the radiation belt guy. At the University of Iowa, it's the only place they're called the radiation belts instead of the Van Allen belts, because according to Van Allen, the Van Allen belt holds up its pants. I mention this because I had a number of discussions with him about UFOs. So while he would be somewhat skeptical, I found his interest in discussing this phenomenon very interesting. And I think it's because James Van Allen was, at this point I was talking to him, was of such stature that a little UFO talk here and there wouldn't hurt him at all. And I mentioned to him the Tunguska crash, and it was about the time that the Fire came out, was suggesting it was an alien spacecraft. And Van Allen had some very interesting comments about that, and I found it interesting. He knew a great deal about this already. And I said, well, you know that they found traces of cesium-138, I think it was, on the site where this thing supposedly crashed. And he said, what's your source for that? Not that it didn't happen, not that it's not true, it's what's your source for that? And I quoted the Russian scientist who said that. And then he said, well, you know, cesium-138 was found in the snowfall in Iowa City in the 1960s, and it was based on the fallout from the atomic blasting that had been done in the 50s and 60s. But what I say, again, is interesting is that Van Allen had come forward and said, well, what is your source on that? Not that it's not true. So science is about evidence. What can we present in the way of evidence? Well, when we take a look at the UFO phenomenon, we hear that you have no evidence. Your testimony is all anecdotal. And my question to those is always, what do you want in the way of evidence? Because I'll tell you where to find it. They have never really looked at the phenomenon. They have heard that there is no evidence and the testimony was all anecdotal, so we can ignore it. I try to point them to the sightings where there is instrumentality involved, so it's something that's not necessarily interpretation by a human, but something that can be tested. That's why I mentioned the Montana films. But science should be dispassionate. Science is a good thing. Some scientists are not so good. So the science is about evidence, and where does the evidence take us in all of this? And what we found out is that evidence can be testimony, and testimony can be considered hard if it's properly gathered. So if we take out the leading questions, we take out the interpretations, well, what do you think you saw? But deal with the questions about what did you see, what's the exact description, then we've moved the testimony from the anecdotal to the scientific observation. Science can also be duplication, and I mention this simply because, again, Ted Phillips talked about the landing traces and how he could tell what the landing traces would look like based on the description of the craft. So we have a great, interesting body of evidence that suggests something real is going on, and it's based on the physical evidence. And evidence can be experimentation. So where I applaud the two 20-somethings for trying to conduct an experiment, I have to belittle them for their lack of understanding science. They were going to show us how it was. They were going to teach us critical thinking, and all they did was prove that their bias led them to the direction they wanted to go. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is take ufology away from the skeptics. We allow them to set the standards. We allow them to tell us what we need to do. Instead of doing that and responding to skeptical arguments, we should take hold of what we want to do, and we should go forward and gather our testimony properly, gather our evidence properly. Don't allow them to call the testimony of the witnesses anecdotal, because I can turn around and say to some of the astronomers out there, well, what you're telling me about what is happening on Mars or in space is all anecdotal testimony. I want you to prove it. You point to this light and you say, well, that's explainable as this. I want to know how you know that. So I can do the same things to you that you do to me. You can't go to another planet at the moment to gather your evidence, with the exception of Mars, possibly. But an awful lot of the astronomy is done by observation, and we believe that the people doing the observation are gathering that testimony or gathering that evidence in a scientific fashion. We can toughen our standards. We can gather all the evidence. And I know sometimes that's difficult for us to do because nobody's really paying us to go out and gather this testimony or gather this evidence. We do it on our own nickel. We do it with what we have in the way of equipment, and we attempt to make it as scientific as possible. And yeah, we screw things up. I overheard somebody talking about gathering samples at a landing trace case, and they confuse the samples from the landing trace with the control samples. Well, that's sloppy science, and it shouldn't happen. But we need to gather all the evidence. Take a look at it all, and if there's a solution for a case, then we shouldn't come back with all kinds of dumb questions trying to make sure that case remains in the unidentified category. We've got to take a look at this dispassionately. And that was the one thing I asked Van Allen. I said, what can we do to upgrade ufology, upgrade the study we're doing? He says, present the evidence dispassionately. Don't get involved with a explanation that you want. Don't get to a solution that you want. Look at the evidence dispassionately and decide what that evidence tells you. And I know there's a great controversy running through ufology right now about abductions and sleep paralysis. And some of the people involved in it say, well, we know it's not sleep paralysis because some of the witnesses were awake at the time the abduction took place. But I think sleep paralysis, in fact, explains some alien abductions. It's a psychological phenomenon that was little understood when a lot of this research began, but it's much better understood today. So we can't say sleep paralysis doesn't explain abductions. It explains some of them, but not all of them. There's a large body of cases out there where sleep paralysis doesn't figure into it at all. What I mean is we look at it dispassionately. We don't just say, well, sleep paralysis is eliminated because we don't like that explanation. We have to take a look at the evidence. And that's the best example I can think of in current ufological thought. And it's going to annoy some people in the room, I'm sure. It certainly doesn't annoy me too much. So what can we do? Well, in the end, we can not allow our beliefs to influence us. Look at the evidence. We can double-check our facts. We can triple-check our facts. We can make sure we have the evidence right. Sometimes we screw up. I believed Frank Kaufman was telling me the truth. I believed it because every time there was a question about his credibility that came forward, he produced a document proving that he was who he said he was. I found it difficult to believe that he would be sitting at home with two typewriters from the 1940s and a stock of paper from that he'd saved from the 1940s and World War II to create these documents that looked good and made it sound like he knew what he was talking about. He had evidence, and his story sounded good. We finally learned the truth about Frank Kaufman simply because we had an opportunity to look at his documentation. One of the things he presented us with was a document for his separation that said he'd been a master sergeant and he'd be trained in intelligence. Since I had that document in hand, I didn't bother to go to St. Louis to find the real one. When he died, Mark Rodiger, Don Schmidt, and Mark Chesney, I think, were asked to investigate some of his papers, and they found the original document showed that he was a master sergeant, he was trained, or a staff sergeant, he was trained in administration. He had doctored the document. I found that extremely difficult to believe. I just couldn't believe somebody would do that. I later learned by reading a book called Stolen Valor that the last 10 people who claimed to be soldiers from the Confederacy, they died in the 1950s, were all liars. Not one of them served in the Civil War. This is sort of understandable because at the time they made the claims of serving in the Civil War, it was during the Great Depression. Very few records existed that anybody could check to make sure that they had served, and they were attempting to gather a retirement pension that was offered by some of the southern states for the Confederate soldiers. So they said they were Confederate soldiers to get their pension, and it grew out from that so that at the end they were given parades, there was big ceremonies about them, and when the second to the last died, the last one became a big hero in the South. But when you went back and you looked at records, you discovered they hadn't been born during the Civil War. They were 5 years old at the end of the Civil War. All kinds of things like that. But the point was, there was a monetary reason for that. But people wanted to believe that these guys were the last, and they didn't bother to check the facts until it was too late. So we need to check our facts. We need to be sure that what we're talking about is right, and we need to think before we speak. J.L.N. Hynek is the best example I can think of this. When the Michigan sightings happened in the mid-1960s, somebody described the sightings to him, and Hynek says, well, it sounds like swamp gas to me. Just an off-the-cuff comment made based on some testimony he had heard, and that became the official explanation. Hynek in no way meant that the solution was swamp gas. He just said it sounded like swamp gas, and that's what it became, and it took on a life of its own because the Air Force said, yeah, swamp gas, I like that. Let's run with that. So we need to think before we speak. We need to make sure of our facts. And one thing that I wanted to applaud, and it came out during the skeptical experiment, was that MUFON alerted its STAR team to check this whole thing out. And within hours of the first launch, they had the answer. And yet, you don't see the news media talking to the MUFON guys because they're going to say it's balloons and flares, but they're talking to the guys that say, well, it buzzed our car. And they're talking to the people that says, well, I don't know what it was. They want the story that is more exciting than the case turns out to be. So we need to make sure of our facts before we speak. And that's not to say that we can't make mistakes. It's not to say that we can offer a solution and discover that we were wrong in that solution and fix that mistake. But we need to be careful about what we say and how we address things. Now, I always like to give an opportunity for people to ask questions at the end of the lectures about what I've talked about here, or anybody who wants to ask about some of my other investigations or whatnot. If you come down to the microphone and shout your question out, I'll try to ignore you as best I can.
I was lucky enough to hear you and Stan and 2 or 3 other people on Larry King recently. Do you remember being on Larry King?
Not for 10, 12 years.
I thought it was you. Maybe it was someone else.
Well, there we go.
Stan was there. Now, here's the question. Larry King would ask a question, and I would think, now hit this one out of the ballpark. And then I would hear a response, and I would say, why is he running off on that tangent that is not interesting to the public at all? Or I would say, when Larry King would have a commercial break, damn, why did he say that?
And by he, you mean
I mean
Dan?
the four of you experts. And I'm wondering why.
Since I wasn't there, I'm
All right,
completely
well,
blameless.
it was someone that looked a lot like you then.
I'm completely
Stan
blameless.
was there? So I'm just wondering, when you get an opportunity to talk before Larry King or some similar interview, why don't you think before you talk and do a really terrific job for the audience?
Well, in my case, what I'll say in my defense is I try to answer the question that's been asked. And sometimes, and politicians are very good at this, sometimes they prefer to answer the question that wasn't asked. They have their own agenda to talk about. Stan, would you like to address this?
I wish I knew what the situation was. I've been on Larry King 3 times in the last 2.5 years. I've never been accused of not responding to what was asked.
I know when I was on Larry King, and Larry King was talking to Phil Klass about something, and I finally said, ask Phil how many of the Roswell witnesses he's interviewed, and Klass said none, and I said, none, you know. But I know in my case, I try to answer the question that's asked. I know, and I hesitate to say this because I don't want to run down Don Schmidt's investigation, but I know Don Schmidt had a tendency to answer the question that he wished had been asked as opposed to the question that was asked. But I haven't been on Larry King for a number of years, so I'm completely blameless.
Stan, the point is, when you get a chance, hit the ball out of the ballpark.
I've seen.
You go ahead and ask.
And I've seen Stan do that any number of times. And Stan, if you want to address that, please take the floor. Although I hesitate to give you an opportunity to talk because I know you like to hear yourself talk.
You've got me right spot on, Kevin. Well, look, let me give you a specific example. Bill Nye, the science guy whose purpose is to deny, showed a document in which a couple of words had been blacked out and ranted a bit about all these UFO nuts say the government's covering things up, and all they've taken out of this is the guy's address, privacy matter. Now, my response was to dig out my book, which fortunately was right there.
There's a surprise.
Be prepared is the Boy Scout marching song. And to open it to the page on which there was a CIA UFO document that was blacked out except for 8 words. And I'm sure on television you couldn't read the 8 words, but you could certainly see the blackout. I thought I hit that one out of the park.
I would agree. Oh, sure. I do this big, long lecture. He takes 10 seconds to talk, and you applaud him. I may be going home tonight.
You should have said, thank you for listening. That gives us a chance to applaud.
There you go. But, and one of the things I want to talk about this Privacy Act, I was looking at the Arnold case in the Project Blue Book files, and they'd even gone and blacked out his initials in a transcript, so you couldn't know it was Kenneth Arnold. But on one page, in big black letters written in a grease pencil, it said Arnold sighting. So you could figure it out from there. But I've seen Stan do that a number of times, and we attempt to answer the questions as best we can with the limited time we have. Sometimes the explanation to refute a skeptical statement takes an awful lot of time and an awful lot of knowledge for people to understand where you're coming from. And I've run into that a couple of times. You can say, Jesse Marcel's a liar, and we proved it with his files. And I can say, but the files were created by draftees whose incentive may not be as accurate as they could, so things that Jesse Marcel said may in fact have been true. The file happens to be accurate, but everybody wants to believe the documentation.
Well, I think you hit it out of the ballpark. I remember that conversation with Klass.
I
took such delight out of that. And another example of that, and this was done by Larry King himself, believe it or not. He had Dave Jacobs on, asked Klass's opinion about his new book at that time. Oh, those people are all mentally disturbed. The foreword to the book was written by John Mack, who was in a position to judge that, which, of course, Klass was not. Later in the show, Larry, I don't know what got into him, but he suddenly asked Phil if he had read the book. And Phil said no. That's hitting it out of the park.
Yes. Thank you, Stan.
Yes. All right. I've noticed that there tends to be an explanation du jour that keeps going around in various eras. For a while there, it was swamp gas, and then it was Venus. And around the time of the Phoenix Lights, it was military flares. Currently, it seems to be Chinese lanterns. Apparently, everything that happens in England is either psychosocial or a Chinese lantern. Do you have any comment on these various explanations du jour?
Well, that's a really, really big question to tackle. I think you're absolutely right. There seems to be a pattern. I know in the Minot sightings, they were talking about it being ionization of the air around near the aircraft that were creating these sightings, and I couldn't really understand what was going on, so I called a physicist, not Stan, but a fellow in Omaha, and I was talking to him about the ionization of the air. And I couldn't seem to understand what he was saying until it suddenly dawned on me, the ionization of the air doesn't glow. And so there couldn't be a visual sighting if it was just ionization of the air. There had to be another component to it. So, but they liked that when it first came out. And I think class offered part of that in the beginning, but they liked it because it sounded scientific. And so if you've got something that sounds scientific, well, that works. The other part of that is, in the Phoenix Light, part of that was flares. And the experiment that was done in New Jersey, that was flares. And there's an awful lot of people who've launched these hot air balloons, which were flares. So that's really a proper explanation. So if the explanation is proper, then there's not a problem with it. I think part of the other problem is once somebody does something like that, it gives the idea to all the other lame teenagers out there who can't think of this stuff themselves, say, well, that was a good idea. Let's attach some railroad flares to some balloons and float them over the town and see what happens, never thinking that if the flare drops off while it's still burning, you could set something on fire, which would be a real annoyance. Fortunately, most of the teenagers are now inside playing with their computers, so we don't have to worry about that. Or playing with their cell phones or their Twitter or whatever the hell it is this week. Filing false reports on CNN. But yeah, you're right. There seems to be a pattern of explanation du jour, and I think if it sounds scientific, it sounds good. Well, if it worked in one case, we'll try it again because we'll see how far it'll go. And once, it's the old football cliche, keep running the play until they stop it, then switch plays. So we'll keep using the explanation until somebody comes up with a rational explanation to get rid of that and come up with a new one. Because any explanation is better than no explanation whatsoever, ever. Yes.
Just suppose stories. One brief little story. Heine called me, and I was off somewhere in Colorado.
As we all are now.
So he had to, he had to run me down to ask about swamp gas because I was a biologist. And I told him I didn't know. But a couple of years later, I visited him in his office, and his wall was wallpapered with swamp gas cartoons.
Showing that he had at least a sense of humor.
Yeah, it went on and on for years.
Were you at Bill Benson's hideaway in Wisconsin a month ago?
No.
Well, who was that?
I have no idea. I wasn't there.
But there was somebody else talking about, are you absolutely sure?
I'm going to have to find this guy who looks like me.
You, yeah.
Hunt him down and stop him.
Because he had an absolute talk, just like you did, about sleep paralysis and the whole kit and caboodle.
The thing you have to remember about sleep paralysis is it will explain some cases. It does not explain them all.
Okay.
So we can't use it as a blanket explanation.
Okay.
But we have to remember that it does explain some. When I investigated the Pat Roach case in 1976, and my wife has always been mad at me about this because we were out in Utah and she had long straight hair, and Ted Bundy was in Utah at the same time looking for young women with long straight hair. I'd put her at risk. I talked to her at length. She was the first one to report the aliens had come into the house and reported a number of things like that. But I said at the end of the various reports that unless we learn something about psychological phenomena we do not now know, this case is inexplicable. I am now convinced that Pat Roach experienced sleep paralysis. And the ancillary testimony came about because she talked to her children, the young children who were very impressionable, about the UFO sightings and these things for 2 years. Now, she said that others in the neighborhood were involved, but we could never locate any of those people and identify them. I am convinced that case, and that case alone, for tonight, is explainable as sleep paralysis. There are others that probably are. There are many that are not. But sleep paralysis must be considered, and I was talking to Kathleen Martin about this today, and she offered, I said we need to develop a protocol to distinguish between sleep paralysis and alien abduction. And she mentioned a couple of things very, very interesting today in the arena of developing that protocol. So we can say that. But in David Jacobs' book, Secret Life, I think it's page 35, he describes the typical abduction experience. He's also described a typical sleep paralysis episode. So we need to be able to distinguish between the two, which is not to say that his research is all wrong or anything like that, or is all explainable. It's that typical fictional abduction that he describes could be explained as sleep paralysis as well, and we need to be able to distinguish between the two as we continue our research.
So if a person has a sleep paralysis and they wake up and a piece of them is actually gone surgically,
then it would not be sleep paralysis.
I didn't think so. Thank you.
Moving right along, I guess. Well, surely somebody else must want to know something. We could talk about, oh, you need to come down here. Maybe that's inhibiting the conversation here.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are about the recent deathbed testimonies that have been made in the Roswell case, particularly
the Walter Haut testimony.
The Walter Haut testimony.
I am disturbed by the affidavit. I know that Don Schmidt put it together. I have no problem with that. That he culled it from things that Walter had said. But I've also been privy to some of the raw interview footage of Walter around 2000. And in the course of that conversation, it's where he began to talk about being more deeply involved than he'd led us all believe for 20 years. In the course of that raw footage, that raw interview tape, he tends to contradict himself sometimes in a single sentence. I don't know if that is an artifact of his advanced age or advancing age, his mental condition because of his personal life situation, or his deteriorating health. All those things come into play, and I really do not understand all the problems with advanced age. And if I had questions, I'd ask Stan about that. I got to take a shot here and there, Stan. What can I say? I do know that as people age, the memory plays tricks on them, and there's problems with that. And that events that should be very important to their core belief structure as being exposed to alien spacecraft and alien bodies in 1947 would have been to Walter Haut. That stuff should remain fairly accurate in the memory. But I also know as you access memory, as you think about events, they tend to mutate in your mind. You get colors wrong, you change the sequence of events. You do it unconsciously, but each time you access a memory, you may subtly alter it. And I say may subtly alter it. There was an experiment done right after the Challenger blew up, where the psychologist gave a survey of 6 simple questions to the students in his class. Where were you when you heard about it? What did you hear? Blah, blah, blah. When they were seniors, he went back to those people and he asked them, they had the same 6 questions, and then the 7th question was, how accurate do you believe your memories to be? They all believed them to be accurate. But when you compared the statements that they had given 3 years before with the statements they were given later, you found out 25% of them were completely wrong. Students who were clearly in college said, well, I was at home when I heard about that. which is not to say everybody's memory was inaccurate. Some of them remembered it exactly. But what struck me was so many people had gotten it wrong, and then when he pointed out what they said was, I don't care what that says, this is how I remember it. Well, this is what you wrote down before. So memory changes. Memory is altered. Loretta Proctor, I think, added, in the mid-1990s, I think, added the idea that there was pinkish writing on the piece of debris that Mac Brazel saw, that showed them. She had never said anything like that. I am thoroughly convinced that she believed that to be the truth, and that in all the discussions and the documentaries and interviews that have been conducted, she'd picked up this piece of information about this pinkish purplish writing and inserted it into her memory. And so she believed it be the truth. So when you get to Walter Haut, testimony, you could have some of that going on. I really don't know. All I know is the raw data, the raw interviews, could be very, very contradictory from one paragraph to the next, from one sentence to the next. So there may be some of that at play. But the testimony of Walter Haut is extremely important because it gets us into the Roswell case, it teaches us something about it, and some of the ancillary stuff that comes out later may not be all that important to understanding the whole of the case. But the skeptical community would glom onto this and say, well, Walter Haut said this one time and he said this another time, well, they both can't be true. Well, to Walter Haut, they both may have been true. So you can't say that. There was a movie on about a girl who thought her father had killed her playmate 25 years ago, and she remembered this under hypnotic regression and other witness or memory enhancement techniques. And at the end of the movie, they said, well, who do you believe was telling the truth? My answer was, I think they both were. She sincerely believed her father had killed the girl. Her father said he didn't do it. I think they were both telling the truth. She was just confused. So we have that problem, but Walter Haut's testimony is very important, and it gives us another clue. And I'll go one step further, and I put this on I had this on my blog, which cleverly is over there, so you all can write down and come and visit my blog. There's a guy named Harris, who's in the yearbook, was an assistant finance officer, and he told me in 1995 or 1996, long before this affidavit came out, that Walter Haut that he'd been in the hangar where the bodies were stored, and Walter Haut said to him, you want to see the aliens? They're in the next room. And the guy wouldn't open the door. He was afraid to do it. But what this does is verify a little bit what Walter said later on, that he was involved very, very heavily.
Thank you.
Involved very heavily.
The mic is acting up.
Pardon me?
The microphone is acting up. We're getting funny sort of
You saw all the trouble they had with getting the computer to work, and now my microphone is going? Who did I not pay off? Stan is going to talk now. There's a surprise.
Just a quick comment,
Yes.
Kevin, that I get asked about Walter Haut's testimony, too. And I have to tell people, A, that I would never call Walter a liar.
And neither would I.
No. B, I saw one interview in which words were being put in his mouth.
Oh, I've seen a number of those.
And C, there are things that he said that I find difficult to believe, that he supposedly said, that are difficult to believe. The presence of Dubose and Ramey at the morning meeting is hard for me to believe. And that Jesse Marcel Sr. apparently saw the bodies too, and both Jesse Jr. and I have trouble with that as well.
Well, and this is the thing. People have asked me about how close was Jesse Jr. to his father, and would he have told him about this? And the story that I know, and Jesse Jr. told me this long, long ago, was that he wanted to know what the atomic bomb looked like. And this was back in the 1940s when nobody knew what they looked like, but the people dropped it. And he said that his father drew, I think it was Fat Man for him, let him take a look at it, then shredded it and burned it up. What this tells me is Jesse Sr. was so in love with his son, for the lack of a better term, that he would share this kind of classified information with him. So if Jesse Sr. had seen the bodies, I am convinced he would have told his son. And since, and it apparently never did.
I have been unable to find flight logs for Dubose and Ramey, And we have the question of, since we know that Marcel was back in Texas later that day, that it's kind of confusing. Why didn't they bring the stuff back? You know, so what I'm saying is that the evidence, and you use the word quite appropriately, that those things happened doesn't seem to exist. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Jesse seeing a body.
Yes.
Or the other two guys being at the office. The last conversation I had with Colonel Retired General Dubose was that if he remembers anything more, he'll tell me, what can they do to me now, Stan, was what he said. He was 87, I think, at the time. So he gave no indication of that either.
Yeah, so then it becomes a question, was Walter Haut telling the truth? Well, he was telling the truth as best he could.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that it was accurate.
Right.
So we do have some of those problems.
Yeah, we agree that you can't always get the straight scoop umpteen years later from people who told their story hundreds of times. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, yes. And one thing I'd like to say about military records, and especially flight records, mine are really screwed up. I think, as you know, I was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and my records don't really say where I flew to or where I flew from, even though we always logged the flights as cross-country because it was better time than local area, which we could log it. But my records, my flight records, really don't give you the kind of information that you'd like. And I was one of those guys, unlike some pilots who keep very meticulous personal records, I didn't do that. I figured the Army's keeping track of it for me. That's good enough. I've since learned that was a mistake. We got time for one more? One more. Here we go. One more. This is it.
Well, it's a big question for the last question, but perhaps you can just comment on the recent trend toward scientists thinking in terms of parallel realities, extra dimensions, as you would have it. It seems like I read that 56% of scientists now believe in parallel realities, and probably because they can write equations for it. They won't believe in UFOs when they see them, but if they see an equation, they'll believe it. And I'm just wondering what your comment might be on that.
The thing that came to my mind immediately was that 4 out of 5 dentists who recommend chewing gum recommend sugarless gum, which means some of those statistics are just meaningless. But I'm very interested in this multiple dimension universe thing, because that could explain some UFO sightings. I'm extremely excited about them talking about wormholes, how we can fly across the universe that way. I love stories of time travel. And so when you say, well, some UFOs could be time travelers, I'm in love with that, but the question becomes, where is the evidence for that? And there was a marvelous science fiction story, and I forget who wrote it, but they'd invented time travel, and they were going to go back to look at the crucifixion of Christ. And they couldn't get close to it because of all the other time travelers in the area who wanted to watch the crucifixion of Christ because of a great historical event. So some things, seem to be self-explanatory. But I love all those sorts of things. But some scientists, if you smacked them over a head with a bit of flying saucer material, they wouldn't believe it because they just simply can't believe it. They cannot wrap their brain around this idea. And I know Stan in his lecture makes a wonderful point about how some scientists have come forward and says you can't do this because the figures show you can't do it. And of course, Robert Goddard decided, well, you can do it, so he went out and did it. So you have to be careful in that sort of thing. I think that's all we've got time for. I thank you all for your patience. It's late on a Saturday night. I have some of my books, Scientific Ufology, here because I know you're not going to come around tomorrow and look for them. If you'd like to purchase copies of those, I've got a few copies up here. And if not, then we'll all go home and go to bed. And I'm going to turn this over to John Greenwald, who's done a wonderful job.
Thank you, Dr. Randle, and thank you all. I know it's been a long day, so I'm going to say goodnight to you all. We do start at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Peter Robbins is going to be first up, and there's quizzes on everything that you guys learned.